with data on human environmental interactions with Dr. Diana Ter-Ghazaryan from Florida International University. Today's talk is the second in a series of seminar presentations we have called GIS from the Ground Up, Introducing Geospatial Tools for Archaeological Research. If you didn't join us last week, during each of the next 5 weeks, a different scholar of archaeology, heritage, and/or GIS in the South Caucasus will present on a different GIS technique, focusing on how it contributes to their research questions. We welcome audience members at all levels of GIS experience, but the aim of the presentations are to introduce scholars unfamiliar with geospatial methods to the anatomy of a GIS-focused research project and elements of GIS research design through real-world case studies. Our seminar presentation next week will feature Dr. William Dedman of Durham University, who will discuss the EAMENA methodology, Arcgis remote sensing, GIS, and archaeological change detection. And you can register for that seminar on ARISC's website, www.arisc.org. Before we get started, we also want to acknowledge that this series is co-hosted by the American Research Institute of the South Caucasus, or ARISC, Endangered Archaeology in the Middle East and North Africa, or EAMENA, as well as the National Agency for Cultural Heritage Preservation of Georgia. Funding for this series is provided by the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs through a grant to the Council of American Overseas Research Centers. I now have the pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Diana Ter-Ghazaryan. Dr. Ter-Ghazaryan is a faculty research associate at Florida International University's GIS Center, where she works with the university community to incorporate geospatial approaches into all levels of teaching, research, and operations. She is a researcher and educator with 15 years of experience in collection, visualization, and analysis of geospatial data. Her theoretical work has focused on urban landscapes and how national identity, social memory, and cultural heritage are inscribed onto those landscapes. Her current scholarly focus is in the realm of geospatial technology and geohumanities, and she teaches courses in applications of geospatial tech, WebGIS, cartography, and geospatial intelligence. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Diana Ter-Ghazaryan. Diana?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Lindsay and Talim, and thank you to ARISC and all the other sponsors of this webinar series for the invitation. And welcome all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for your attention. I'm going to now share my screen. You should all be seeing my PowerPoint presentation, and without any further ado, I will get into talking a little bit about answering spatial questions with suitability modeling. So today's presentation, if you didn't attend last week's presentation by Dr. Hopper, today's presentation will be slightly different in that I'll be primarily talking about a tool, or really a solution within GIS, within geospatial technology, which is suitability modeling, and talking about the suitability modeler within a GIS package that I use in my work. I will be giving some examples of work that has been done by my colleagues and talking briefly about work in which we'll be using this archaeologically related work in which we will be using suitability modeling in the future. So I won't be giving as many examples as Dr. Hopper did from the work in the South Caucasus, but nevertheless, there will be some examples from published work from my colleagues and a preview of what we'll be working on in the future. Like I said, to reiterate, today's presentation is mostly focused on talking about this approach, so the approach of suitability modeling and how it can be used in research related to archaeology and cultural heritage preservation. So Dr. Hopper last week gave a great introduction into what GIS is and what GIS can do specifically for archaeology and cultural heritage preservation, but I have a brief slide here underlining the way in which I think about GIS and the way in which I use it in my research and teaching. I think of it as a framework to organize, communicate, and understand our world spatially at the most basic level, right? Rooted in the science of geography and really with an eye towards data. GIS is about data. GIS is about collecting, visualizing, analyzing, and understanding the data. And really, it is a framework for decision support. That's the way in which I think about it. And suitability modeling is a great example of that. Suitability modeling allows people make better decisions about where to site things, right? So since GIS is rooted in the science of geography, it is inextricably linked to location, right? Location being the most important component of GIS. And once we have that component, we then think about the various attributes, the various variables that may help us make decisions about which location is best for something or other, right? So where to build the next hospital, that is a question that can be answered with GIS and specifically with suitability modeling. Which areas are the most likely to flood during the next major rainstorm? I am in Florida, we get a lot of flooding here. So thinking about flood zones and so on, GIS is very, very useful for that. So which natural areas are the most important to preserve? And going into that, suitability modeling can help you determine which physical features of a location make it a good candidate for preservation based on what species are in that area and so on. And for the crowd here, right, where will the next dig site be? Suitability modeling can help answer those questions. And some of the examples that I will give from work that some of my colleagues have done, and I have helped them with the GIS component of it, will answer just those questions, right? Like Dr. Lindsay said, I am a geographer and a geospatial technologist, not an archaeologist, but I am working with a team of archaeologists. So some of the terminology that I'll use, please forgive me if I'm misusing archaeological terminology, but because I only know it tangentially. And I will be speaking primarily to the geospatial component of locating the dig site and so on. So I will talk about here in a little bit a study that my colleagues have carried out where they use suitability modeling, and we currently have funding pending to do a little bit more of that with more complicated models. So what is suitability modeling? It is a technique, it is a workflow, it is a solution essentially within GIS software, and not only GIS software, but today here we're talking about the geospatial. So I'm going to keep it within that realm. It is a workflow that is used to identify the best location to site, to build something, or to do something, right? Where is the best location to locate the next dig site? Where is the best location? Which heritage memorials are the most important to preserve based on their location, and of course, a whole host of other variables. So the best location depends on the features at each location, right? If you're trying to cite, let's say, if you're trying to preserve habitat for an endangered species, you know the parameters, and you know the features that that species needs in order to best survive, right? So for example, you know which slope a specific tree species likes, the land use type, how far from a road or a stream it needs to be. So suitability modeling combines those features, combines the variables from those features as layers, and it then stacks them and calculates the most suitable areas, the areas where all of those features are present or at an optimal level, and generates a probabilistic outcome of where is the best location, right? So you can do suitability modeling a couple of different ways. You can either do binary, which is in which all of the features are going to be present. So you're going to say preservation is possible within this area and not possible within areas that don't meet all of the criteria. Or you can do probabilistic. You can weight the various layers such as slope, land use type, how far from a road or stream, and then you can give it scores, right? So let's say if you have a score of 1, then that is the best possible habitat for that species. Whereas if you have a score of 3, 4, or 5, then it becomes a little bit less likely and difficult. So these features are the criteria which are evaluated together, either with equal weights or different weights, depending on the work that you are doing. So here is what the workflow of suitability modeling looks like. First, of course, you need to define the goal, right? What it is that you are looking to design suitability for. Of what are you looking to find suitability? For what are you looking to find suitability, right? Here I have an example from the natural sciences, and that is for bobcat habitat. We know that bobcats like hilly areas, so elevation and slope are going to be important. We also know that they cannot thrive in urban areas, right? Or they have difficulty thriving in urban areas. So land use is important, and also they need access to water, right? So distance to streams is going to be an important component. So here we're looking at the base criteria. So you've got the three features, the three base criteria here. You then derive some data sets from the base criteria. We derive a slope surface from elevation, from a digital elevation model, and we design distance to streams based on the data set of streams here. We then transform those data into yes, no, or into areas that allow for bobcat habitat to be present, right? So in this image right here shows you places where slope is conducive to bobcat habitat, whereas slope is not conducive to bobcat habitat. Same with land use here, and same with distance, right? You then combine these three, essentially you stack them together, right? And create this surface that allows you to determine where that habitat is going to be most favorable, and you then locate the spots. So here you're looking at those spots, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? 7 locations within this area where bobcat habitat is going to be optimal. So here I'm giving an example from the natural sciences about bobcat habitat, but you can do the very same thing for locating dig sites for archaeologists. And that is exactly what a team of colleagues that I work with did, right? And I'll give some examples of that here in a minute, but they combined elevation, land use, location, distance to streams or to coasts, and then weighted it together to then design areas where that would be most productive, that we predicted would be most productive for digging, for deciding where the dig sites were going to be. All right, so we looked at the images. So let's just quickly go down the steps of suitability modeling. First, we need to determine and prepare the criteria data. Then we transform the value of each criteria to a common suitability scale, because what you're essentially doing map algebra, right? You are stacking things on top of one another and calculating the sum. The higher the sum, the more likely you're going to be, the more suitable that area is going to be for whatever it is you're trying to build, design, or find. You can also weight criteria relative to one another and combine them to create a suitability map. So for example, if you know, let's say, and just go with me here, right? You're looking for siting a new dig site, and you know that elevation is going to play a more important role than, let's say, land use, right? So you would weight the elevation component or the slope component a little bit more heavily. You would give it a stronger weight. You would give it a weight of 1.5 or even 2, depending on what it is. What are the rest of the ingredients in your recipe? So sometimes I think of suitability modeling the workflow as a recipe, right? You can tweak some things here and there depending on what it is, the outcome, what you hope the outcome to be, and when you know what ingredients are going into that recipe. And then the final step is the location of the areas for the siting or to preserve, right? So in the case of archaeology, to site, to begin prospecting, digging. The way that I've done, the tool that I have used in helping a team of archaeologists with this is the Arcgis Suitability Modeler. So this is from Esri's ArcGIS suite, which is a proprietary software, And I know that in QGIS, suitability modeling is also possible, but it's a little bit more involved. I believe suitability modeling can be done within R as well. But the work that we did was within ArcGIS ArcMap and more recently ArcGIS Pro. So within ArcMap and within ArcGIS Pro, there is also an extension called Model Builder. And before the creation of this new suitability modeler, which is a specific instance of Model Builder that is optimized just for suitability, you could do it as well. And a Model Builder, essentially what you did is you strung together a series of actions on feature layers. And you ran it all together. So if we go back to the image here, just for me to break it down, so each time you see an arrow, that's essentially a geoprocessing tool that runs, right? So, or rather not at this point, but when you generate a slope surface from elevation, that's a geoprocessing tool that's run. When you transform the slope into a yes, no, right? Above, let's say above 50% slope, below 50% slope, that is also a geoprocessing tool. That tool specifically is a reclassified tool. From land use, going to conducive versus non-conducive, this is also a reclassification. In this case, going from streams to distance, you are generating buffers around streams, and you are then reclassifying the buffer surface, right? So essentially what you're looking at here is a conceptual model of the steps that you are going to take to generate the suitability surface, right? Here, this final result that you're looking at here is the suitability surface. It's a yes-no analysis of where the bobcat habitat or the location, the most likely areas where dig sites are going to be, or where archaeological sites are going to be based on the criteria that you've piped into the model. So suitability modeler is a more dynamic, nonlinear, so it's a more dynamic way to think about modeling. And because model creation, those of you who have created models or have thought about the workflow, it's a nonlinear iterative process, right? So it's not a one and done type of thing where you create, where you stack things together, right? If you'll allow me this example, right? It's not like a layer cake, right? You put the layers together and then the cake is ready to cut into. You cut into it and you enjoy it, right? It's almost as if you're making a sheet cake of all these various layers, but you need to continuously replace the layers and make them better. So that's what I mean when I talk about a nonlinear and iterative process, because you may generate a suitability surface, then go out and begin ground truthing and find that the areas that you've generated do not actually fit the purpose of what you're trying to do, right? In which case you need to go back to the model and replace the layers. So as I mentioned, Suitability Modeler is a solution within ArcGIS Pro. Just quickly for ArcGIS, because as we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this is for complete beginners. So just a brief introduction to it. This is proprietary software from Esri, but that offers powerful and flexible software for location analytics. You know, it's kind of an end-to-end solution. But as I tell all my students always, learning how to do something in ArcGIS versus in QGIS versus in Saga versus in GRASS, it's almost as if you're learning to write with different colored pens, right? The point is that you learn how to write. The most important component is thinking about the concepts and thinking about the theoretical background. Learning to do something in one software versus another, it's like writing with different colored pens. The point is that one learn how to write, right? So while we've done a lot of this work in, or most of this work in ArcGIS, in this proprietary software, a lot of what I'm talking about can be achieved with open source resources as well. Though specifically for suitability modeling with a little bit more of a time investment, I must confess. So at this point, I'll give a couple of examples of use of suitability modeling in archaeological research. And then I will take questions and comments from the audience. So this is work, and this work is not from the South Caucasus. This is work that I have helped my colleagues working in Puerto Rico, but it is on archaeological work on siting best locations, on prospecting best locations for dig sites in the central part of Puerto Rico, the island of Puerto Rico. So you see here in this little inset map, the location that the team studied. And these are the various layers that this researcher stacked together and piped into a suitability model to find the best locations for the dig sites. So starting with an elevation model, she then generated aspect and slope. She looked at locations of shelter. She looked at relief and generated cost surfaces of distance from streams and from the coast. So after running a suitability model on that, she generated locations of probabilities, of high probabilities of archaeological sites and low probabilities of archaeological sites. So on the left, you see the full probability surface, which is the result of the suitability analysis. And on the right, in the blue and red, you see the probabilities above 0.5 and the p-value above 0.5 and the p-value below 0.5. And the sites are the sites that were sampled, that had been sampled. I don't know if she was the one who sampled all of them, but the red ones were actually yielded a site, a dig site, and the black ones did not yield a black site. So it looks like a dig site. So it looks like there, no probability model, no suitability model is going to be a 100% proof, right? Because again, this is a probability. Suitability model generates a probability for you, but nevertheless, it lessens the burden of having to dig in areas without some prior preparation. Here's another example from work that this is a team that I have worked with. Will Pessel is a colleague of mine. He's he's an archaeologist, anthropological archaeologist, and we are working on we have new research that's, we have proposed a new research project with funding pending where we are going to be using a more sophisticated suitability model to locate dig sites, to locate and to ground truth dig sites in the southwestern corner of Puerto Rico. And this is earlier research that I helped him with a GIS component of. And essentially in this case, we stacked together slope, surface, rather slope for the area, distance from water, be that coast or streams, elevation, and so on and so forth. In our newly proposed research, we are going to be incorporating viewshed, and we have some new ideas about how we're going to be doing that. I'm not at liberty to speak much more about that component because that's funding pending, but at a later point, I'd be happy to discuss more details about that. So once again, going back to the image of suitability modeling, right? The workflow, the idea there is to think about the goal, to define the goal of what you're looking to do, to think about what physical characteristics are going to determine or play a role in whether or not the location of what it is you're trying to do will be suitable for that. You then derive the data, you play with the data, you then transform the data, and then you weight and combine the layers, the features, to then locate areas where your probability or your suitability model is telling you, that's a tongue twister, right? Suitability model is telling you will be best suited for what you're trying to do. And then the iterative process. So these, in this image specifically, the arrows are in one direction, right? But really it's back and forth. The iteration happens a lot in this space of deriving the data, transforming the data, weighting and combining the data. And the way in which one iterates this model is by ground truth and going back and forth between the field, collecting more data and gathering more understanding in order to be able to make the model better. So at this point, I'll stop with the portion of the presentation on suitability modeling Dr. Lindsay and Talin, if there's time, I can briefly preview USGS Earth Explorer. Dr. Hopper talked about that last week, and I can talk briefly about Esri's Living Atlas, which is a web-based solution, and there is a free of charge component of that as well. So an open source component of that as well. All you need is an account for that.
Yeah, sure. We have 5 or 10 minutes before questions if you want to do that, and we can
Sounds
fold
great.
that into the Q&A section if there are questions about that.
Let's see if there are questions about this specifically, and then I
Okay.
can talk about, because that's switching gears. So let's see if there are questions about this workflow.
Sounds good. So if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I think we are going to unmute folks as